Picture this, a small-town diner where everyone knows your name, your business, and your failures. Where whispers follow you like shadows, and laughter cuts deeper than any knife. Now imagine that same diner falling silent as military helicopters thunder overhead, and the very people who mocked you yesterday are suddenly looking at you with a mixture of fear, respect, and complete bewilderment. This is the story of Maya Chen, a quiet woman who worked the night shift at Murphy's Diner in Cedar Falls, Idaho. For 3 years, she endured the cruel jokes, the dismissive glances, and the small-town cruelty that comes with being different. They called her Silent Maya, the ghost, and worse things behind her back. They laughed when she claimed to speak 5 languages. They rolled their eyes when she mentioned her previous career. They treated her like she was nothing more than a washed-up dreamer pouring coffee in a dead-end town. But Maya Chen had secrets that ran deeper than the mountain lakes surrounding Cedar Falls. Secrets that involved classified missions in places most people couldn't pronounce. Secrets that connected her to the most elite fighting force in the world. And, when those secrets finally surfaced on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, everything changed. The mockery stopped. The laughter died. And, suddenly, everyone realized they had been sharing their morning coffee with someone far more dangerous and extraordinary than they could have ever imagined. This is her story. Maya Chen moved through Murphy's Diner like a whisper, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the checkered linoleum floor. At 32, she possessed an understated elegance that seemed out of place in the small Idaho town of Cedar Falls. Her black hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, her uniform pressed and spotless, and her movements carried a precision that most people mistook for nervousness. The regulars at Murphy's had their own opinions about Maya. To them, she was just another drifter who'd washed up in their mountain town 3 years ago, claiming to be looking for a fresh start. Fresh start from what, they wondered. She never talked about her past, never joined the local church, never dated anyone in town. She worked the graveyard shift, lived alone in a modest apartment above Henderson's hardware store, and kept to herself. Tom Morrison, who owned the auto repair shop next door, was particularly vocal about his suspicions. Every morning, he'd settle into his usual booth, order his black coffee and wheat toast, and hold court with whoever would listen. "There's something off about that woman," he'd say, stirring his coffee with unnecessary force. "Nobody just shows up in Cedar Falls with no history, no family, no nothing. And, have you seen how she watches people? Like she's studying them or something." Betty Walsh, the town's unofficial gossip coordinator, would nod knowingly from her perch at the counter. "I heard she told Jenny at the post office that she speaks Chinese." Chinese? Who does she think she's fooling? Probably read it in some book and thinks she's worldly. Maya heard every word, of course. Her hearing had been trained to pick up conversations from across crowded rooms, to distinguish between footsteps and identify threats before they materialized. But she showed no reaction, simply refilled their cups and moved on to the next table. The truth was, Maya spoke 7 languages fluently, not 5 as she'd once mentioned to a coworker. She could field strip an assault rifle blindfolded, navigate by the stars, and disappear into a crowd of thousands without leaving a trace. She could kill a person with a ballpoint pen, hack into government databases, and survive for weeks in hostile territory with nothing but a knife and her wits. But, in Cedar Falls, she was just the weird night shift waitress who couldn't even get a date. The jokes had started almost immediately after she'd arrived. At first, they were subtle. Rolled eyes when she'd politely correct someone's pronunciation of a foreign word. Smirks when she'd mention something about world events that hadn't yet made it to the local news. Whispered comments about her fancy vocabulary and her habit of reading thick books during her breaks. As time went on, the mockery became more brazen. Jake Muller, a local contractor who thought himself the town comedian, had taken to calling her Professor Maya in a mocking tone. He'd make elaborate jokes about her mysterious past, suggesting she was probably a failed academic who'd cracked under pressure. Maybe she was a librarian in the big city, he'd announced to his buddies, loud enough for Maya to hear. Got fired for being too weird even for the library crowd. The cruelest cut had come from Sarah Peterson, the high school principal's daughter, who'd taken to calling Maya the ghost because of her quiet demeanor and pale complexion. The nickname stuck, spreading through the town's social media groups and becoming a popular hashtag among the younger crowd. Maya endured it all with the same stoic patience she'd once used to withstand interrogation training. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the best cover was to be exactly what people expected you to be. If they saw her as a harmless, slightly odd woman, they wouldn't look deeper. They wouldn't ask the right questions. They wouldn't uncover the truth. The truth was classified at levels that most government officials would never achieve. Maya Chan wasn't just former military. She wasn't even just former Special Forces. She was former Naval Special Warfare Development Group, more commonly known as SEAL Team 6. She was one of the first women to complete the grueling selection process and serve in active combat roles with the most elite counter-terrorism unit in the American military. For 8 years, she'd operated in the shadows, conducting missions that would never appear in any official record. She'd tracked down war criminals in the mountains of Afghanistan, rescued hostages from terrorist compounds in Somalia, and eliminated high-value targets in places that didn't officially exist on any map. She'd earned 3 Purple Hearts, a Distinguished Service Cross, and commendations that were locked away in vaults beneath the Pentagon. She'd saved lives, ended wars, and prevented attacks that could have killed thousands of innocent people. But all of that was behind her now, sealed away behind layers of non-disclosure agreements and classified protocols. In Cedar Falls, she was just Maya the waitress, Maya the loner, Maya the target of small-town cruelty. The worst part wasn't the mockery itself. Maya had endured far worse during her military training and active service. The worst part was the isolation. In the military, she'd been surrounded by people who understood her, who shared her dedication and her sense of purpose. She'd been part of something larger than herself, something that mattered. In Cedar Falls, she was utterly alone. Her only real companionship came from the occasional encrypted message from her former teammates. They checked in on each other regularly, part of an informal support network that helped former operators adjust to civilian life. Most of them had struggled with the transition. Some had found new purpose in private security or law enforcement. Others had started families and tried to build normal lives. Maya had chosen exile. She'd picked Cedar Falls specifically because it was remote, quiet, and far from anywhere that might trigger unwanted attention. She'd thought the isolation would help her heal, help her process the things she'd seen and done during her years of service. Instead, it had become its own kind of prison. The breaking point almost came on a rainy evening in September. Maya was working her usual shift when Jake Muller stumbled in, clearly drunk from his evening at O'Malley's pub. He'd been louder than usual, his jokes meaner, his audience more enthusiastic. "Hey, Ghost," he'd called out as Maya approached his table. "Bring me another beer, and maybe tell us about your secret agent days." He'd made exaggerated kung fu gestures, earning laughs from his companions. Maya had simply nodded and turned to get his order, but Jake wasn't finished. "You know what I think?" he'd continued, his voice carrying across the diner. "I think our mysterious Maya here is nothing more than a fraud. All those hints about her worldly experience, all that quiet mysterious act. I bet she's never been further than Boise." The other patrons had chuckled appreciatively. Even Murphy, the diner's owner, had cracked a smile. "Maybe she watched too many spy movies," Sarah Peterson had chimed in from the counter. "Got confused about what was real and what was make-believe." Maya had stopped walking. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure had slipped. Her hand had moved instinctively toward her hip, where she'd once carried a sidearm. Her muscles had tensed in preparation for combat. Her breathing had shifted into the controlled pattern she'd learned for close-quarters engagement. Then, she'd caught herself, forced her body to relax, and continued to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. But something had changed in that moment. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, Maya had allowed herself to feel angry. That anger had been building for weeks when the helicopters arrived. It was a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the mountains around Cedar Falls look like a postcard. Maya had just finished her shift and was walking to her car when she heard the distinctive wop-wop-wop of military helicopters approaching from the north. Most of the town looked up with mild curiosity. Military aircraft occasionally pass through the area, usually heading to or from Mountain Home Air Force Base. But Maya's trained ear picked up something different about these engines. These weren't Air Force birds. These were Navy helicopters, and they were flying in a specific formation that meant only one thing. They were looking for her. Maya's heart rate spiked as she counted the aircraft. 2 MH-60 Black Hawks, flying low and fast. Standard insertion configuration. She could see the door gunners, could make out the tactical gear of the passengers visible in the cabin windows. This wasn't a training exercise or a routine transport. This was an extraction. The helicopters circled the town once, their rotor wash kicking up dust and debris in the parking lots below. Then, they began to descend, one landing in the empty field behind Murphy's Diner, the other setting down in the high school parking lot across the street. Maya stood frozen beside her car, watching as figures in full combat gear emerged from the aircraft. She recognized the movements, the equipment, the practiced efficiency. These were her people. These were SEALs. The first man to approach her was someone she recognized immediately. Commander Jack Sullivan, her former team leader, a legend in the special operations community. He walked toward her with the same confident stride she remembered from their missions together, but his face was grim. "Maya," he said simply as he reached her. "We need to talk." Around them, the people of Cedar Falls were beginning to emerge from buildings, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Tom Morrison had come out of the diner, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the military personnel now surrounding the parking lot. Betty Walsh was frantically taking pictures with her phone. Jake Muller was nowhere to be seen. Maya looked at Jack, then at the other operators taking positions around the perimeter. She could feel the weight of 100 stares, could sense the shift in the atmosphere as the people who had mocked her for 3 years suddenly realized they might not know her at all. "What's the situation?" she asked quietly, her voice automatically falling back into the professional tone she'd used during briefings. Jack's expression remained serious. "There's been a breach. Someone leaked the locations of former Team 6 operators. Your cover's been compromised, and there are credible threats against multiple targets." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. How credible? 3 attempts in the last 48 hours. 2 successful. The words hit her like a physical blow. 2 of her former teammates were dead. People she'd served with, fought alongside, trusted with her life. And now someone was hunting down the rest of them. "We're implementing emergency extraction protocols," Jack continued. "You have 15 minutes to grab whatever you need, then we're gone." Maya nodded, her mind already shifting into operational mode. But, as she started to turn toward her apartment, she caught sight of the crowd that had gathered outside the diner. Tom Morrison was staring at her with his mouth agape. Betty Walsh had lowered her phone, her face pale with shock. Even Murphy had come outside, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by something that might have been fear. For 3 years, these people had dismissed her as nothing more than a harmless eccentric. They'd laughed at her hints about her past, mocked her quiet demeanor, and treated her like a curiosity rather than a person. Now they were seeing her for what she really was. A Navy SEAL emerged from the second helicopter and approached Jack with a tablet in his hands. Maya recognized the man as Lieutenant Commander Torres, someone she'd worked with on operations in Syria. "Ma'am," Torres said, addressing Maya with the respect she'd once been accustomed to. "We've identified the source of the leak. It's connected to the Richardson case from 2 years ago." Maya's blood ran cold. The Richardson case had been one of her last operations before leaving active duty. A high-value target extraction in Eastern Europe that had gone sideways when their intelligence proved faulty. People had died, and the fallout had reached all the way to Washington. "Who else knows?" she asked. "Full details are in the briefing packet," Jack replied. "But, right now, our priority is getting you somewhere safe." As they spoke, more townspeople had gathered. Maya could see the fear in their faces, could feel the shift in how they were looking at her. The woman they'd called the ghost was suddenly very real, and very dangerous. But it was Sarah Peterson's expression that caught her attention. The young woman who had coined Maya's cruel nickname was staring at her with something that might have been awe, or terror, or both.
"Ma'am?" Jack prompted. "We need to move."
Maya took one last look at the town that had been her refuge for 3 years. Cedar Falls had never felt like home, but it had been peaceful. It had been safe. It had been a place where she could pretend to be normal, even if that pretense came with a daily dose of mockery and isolation. Now that peace was shattered, and she was about to disappear from these people's lives as suddenly as she had appeared. But, first, she had a decision to make. She could leave quietly, maintaining her cover even in departure, or she could give these people a glimpse of who she really was. Maya looked directly at Tom Morrison, the man who had questioned her background for 3 years. Then, she spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot.
"The name's not Maya Chen," she said. "It's Lieutenant Commander Maya Chen, United States Navy.
SEAL Team 6, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the helicopter engines seemed to quiet as the weight of her words settled over the crowd.
Tom Morrison's face had gone white. Betty Walsh dropped her phone.
Jake Muller, who had finally emerged from wherever he'd been hiding, looked like he might faint.
Maya turned back to Jack. "Let's go."
As they walked toward the helicopters, she could hear the whispers starting behind her. The same people who had mocked her were now talking in hushed, reverent tones about the woman they'd unknowingly had living among them. But Maya was already moving forward, her mind focused on whatever danger lay ahead. The quiet life in Cedar Falls was over. The woman they called the Ghost was about to disappear once again, but this time everyone would remember exactly who she had been. The helicopters lifted off in a coordinated departure, their rotor wash scattering the autumn leaves and leaving the people of Cedar Falls staring up at the sky in stunned silence.
Maya Chen, the woman they'd mocked for 3 years, was gone.
But her legend in Cedar Falls had just begun. The flight from Cedar Falls to the secure facility in Montana took 47 minutes, but, for Maya, it felt like a journey back through time. As the Black Hawk thundered over the mountain peaks, she found herself slipping back into the mindset she'd worked so hard to leave behind. The hypervigilance, the tactical awareness, the constant calculation of threats and opportunities. Seated across from her in the helicopter's cabin was Jack Sullivan, still every inch the commanding officer she remembered. At 45, he carried the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much combat, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. Beside him sat Lieutenant Commander Torres and 2 other SEALs Maya didn't recognize, probably newer additions to the team. Through her headset, Jack briefed her on the situation as they flew. The leak came from someone calling himself Prometheus. Real name Viktor Kozlov, former Russian Spetsnaz who went mercenary after the Soviet collapse. He's been selling classified information to the highest bidders for the past 5 years. Maya absorbed the information with professional detachment, but, inside, her anger was building. The men and women she'd served with had earned their anonymity through blood and sacrifice. Their identities were protected not just for their own safety, but for their families, their children, their futures. "How did he get the information?" she asked. Torres pulled out a tablet and showed her a series of documents. "Someone on the inside. We're still trying to identify the source, but Kozlov has detailed records on 43 former Team 6 operators. Names, addresses, new identities, everything." The scope of the breach was staggering. Maya felt a chill as she considered how many lives were now at risk. These weren't just soldiers, they were teachers, business owners, fathers and mothers who'd tried to build normal lives after years of extraordinary service. "You mentioned 2 successful attempts," Maya said quietly. Jack's expression darkened. "Martinez and Thompson. Both killed within hours of each other, different methods but clearly coordinated. Professional hits made to look like accidents." Maya closed her eyes for a moment. She'd served with both men. Martinez had been a demolitions expert with a gift for languages and a weakness for terrible jokes. Thompson had been a sniper whose precision was matched only by his devotion to his wife and twin daughters. Now they were dead because someone had sold their secrets. "Where are we going?" Maya asked, pushing down her grief to focus on the immediate situation. "Blackwater Station," Jack replied. "It's a joint task force facility about 30 miles north of Glacier National Park. We've been using it as a staging area for the operation to track down Kozlov and neutralize the threat." Maya knew about Blackwater Station, though she'd never been there. It was one of several classified facilities used for special operations planning and training, completely off the books and invisible to any oversight that might ask uncomfortable questions. As the helicopter began its descent, Maya could see the facility spread out below them. It looked like a modest research station or park ranger outpost, which was exactly the point. The real installations were underground, hidden beneath what appeared to be storage buildings and maintenance sheds. The landing pad was surrounded by dense forest, with no roads or visible access points. This was a place designed to keep secrets. As they touched down, Maya was struck by how natural it felt to be back in this environment. The purposeful movement of personnel, the sense of controlled urgency, the weight of serious business being conducted. After 3 years in Cedar Falls, it was like coming home to a family she'd forgotten she missed. Inside the main facility, Maya was escorted to a briefing room where she encountered faces both familiar and new. Commander Sarah Park, who'd been her team leader on several operations in the Middle East. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a communications specialist she'd worked with in Somalia. And several others she didn't recognize but who clearly knew her reputation. The reunion was professional but warm. These people understood her in ways the citizens of Cedar Falls never could. They'd shared experiences that bonded them beyond ordinary friendship. They trusted each other with their lives in situations where trust was the difference between coming home and not. But there was also an underlying tension in the room. Everyone here knew they were targets. Everyone understood that their peaceful post-military lives had just been shattered by an enemy they'd never seen coming. Admiral Rebecca Harrison, a woman Maya had never met but whose reputation preceded her, stood at the head of the conference table. As the senior officer present, she commanded immediate attention and respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Harrison began, "we're facing an unprecedented threat to the security and safety of our former special operations personnel. The individual known as Prometheus has compromised the identities of 43 former Team 6 operators and is selling that information to anyone willing to pay his price." She activated a large display screen that showed a map of the United States dotted with red markers. Each marker represented a former operator whose identity had been compromised. Maya felt sick seeing how many there were, how scattered they were across the country. "Our intelligence indicates that Kozlov isn't working alone," the admiral continued. "He's part of a larger network that's been targeting American Special Operations veterans for the past 2 years. Their clients include terrorist organizations, drug cartels, and foreign intelligence services. All groups with very good reasons to want revenge against the people who once hunted them." Torres stepped forward and activated another screen, this one showing surveillance photos of a man Maya didn't recognize. Tall, thin, with the kind of unremarkable face that would disappear in any crowd. Viktor Kozlov, age 52, former Spetsnaz operative turned information broker. He's been operating out of various locations across Eastern Europe, but our latest intelligence suggests he's recently moved his base of operations to somewhere in Central America. Maya studied the photos carefully. She'd learned to read faces during her years in intelligence work, and Kozlov's face told a story of someone who'd chosen money over honor, profit over principle. "What's his motivation?" she asked. Admiral Harrison answered. "Initially, we believed it was purely financial. Kozlov commands substantial fees for high-quality intelligence. But recent intercepts suggest there's a personal element as well. Apparently, his younger brother was killed during a joint operation in Chechnya 15 years ago. An operation that involved several members of SEAL Team 6. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just business for Kozlov. It was revenge. "Our mission," Admiral Harrison continued, "is to locate Kozlov, shut down his network, and eliminate the threat to our personnel. We have authorization to use any means necessary to protect our people." Maya felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had once driven her through the most dangerous missions of her career.
But there was something else too, something darker. For the first time since leaving active duty, she wanted to hurt someone.
She wanted to make Kozlov pay for what he'd done to Martinez and Thompson, and for what he was trying to do to all of them.
Over the next several hours, Maya was brought up to speed on the operation's details.
Intelligence suggested that Kozlov was operating from somewhere in Guatemala, possibly in the remote jungle regions where government control was minimal and privacy could be bought for the right price. The plan was to insert a small team into the area, locate Kozlov's facility, and conduct a direct action mission to eliminate the threat. It was the kind of operation Maya had conducted dozens of times during her active duty, but this time it was personal. "You don't have to do this," Jack told her during a private conversation in the facility's mess hall. "You've been out for 3 years. You've built a new life, even if it wasn't exactly what you wanted. No one would blame you for sitting this one out." Maya considered his words carefully. It was true that she'd officially left this world behind. She'd filed the paperwork, completed the psychological evaluations, and signed the agreements that formally ended her military career. She was a civilian now, theoretically free from the obligations and dangers of her former life. But, as she sat in that sterile government facility, surrounded by people who understood what it meant to serve something larger than themselves, Maya realized that some obligations transcend paperwork.
"Martinez had a daughter," she said quietly.
"She just turned 8. Thompson's twins are starting high school next year."
Jack nodded grimly. "I know.
This isn't about duty anymore," Maya continued.
"This is about family. About protecting the people who can't protect themselves."
She looked around the mess hall, taking in the faces of the other operators who'd been called in for this mission. Some were active duty, others were reserves, and a few like herself were officially retired. But they were all here for the same reason. Besides, she added with a slight smile, "I've been pouring coffee for 3 years.
I could use some excitement." That evening, Maya underwent a series of tests and evaluations to determine her readiness for active duty. Physically, she was still in excellent condition. Years of hiking in the Idaho mountains had maintained her cardiovascular fitness, and she'd never stopped her strength training routines. Mentally, the psychologist cleared her for duty after a brief interview, noting that her time in civilian life seemed to have given her a sense of perspective that might actually improve her operational effectiveness. The weapons qualification was like riding a bicycle. Maya's muscle memory took over as she handled the familiar weight of the M4 carbine, the precision of the SIG Sauer pistol, and the various other tools of her former trade. Her scores were slightly lower than her peak performance from 3 years ago, but still well within acceptable parameters. More importantly, the old instincts were still there. The situational awareness, the tactical thinking, the ability to process complex information and make split-second decisions under pressure. The woman who'd spent 3 years serving coffee in Cedar Falls was gone, replaced by the warrior she'd once been. That night, alone in her assigned quarters, Maya allowed herself to think about what she was leaving behind. Her apartment in Cedar Falls, with its view of the mountains and its blessed anonymity. Her job at Murphy's Diner, mundane but peaceful. The simple routine of a normal life, even if that life had come with a daily dose of mockery and isolation. She thought about Tom Morrison and his constant suspicions, which had turned out to be more accurate than he'd ever imagined. About Betty Walsh and her gossip, which would undoubtedly reach legendary status once the full story of Maya's identity spread through the town. About Jake Muller and his cruel jokes, which suddenly seemed petty and meaningless in light of what she was facing now. Most of all, she thought about the choice she was making. She could have refused this mission. She could have demanded a different kind of protection, a new identity in a new town where she could continue her quiet exile from the world of violence and sacrifice. Instead, she was choosing to return to that world. She was choosing to put herself in danger for people she might never meet, to protect the families and futures of men and women who'd served their country with honor. It wasn't duty that drove her decision. It wasn't patriotism or loyalty to the military. It was something simpler and more personal than that. It was justice. The next morning, Maya joined the final mission briefing. The team would consist of 8 operators, including herself. They would insert into Guatemala via civilian aircraft, traveling under diplomatic cover as members of an environmental research team.
Once in country, they would make contact with local intelligence assets and begin the hunt for Kozlov's facility. The mission parameters were straightforward: locate Kozlov, eliminate him and his key associates, destroy his database of compromised operators, and extract safely. No prisoners, no negotiations, no second chances. As Maya listened to the briefing, she felt the familiar calm that came before dangerous operations. Her mind was clear, her purpose was defined, and her training was taking over. The woman who'd been mocked in Cedar Falls for her quiet demeanor was transforming into something far more dangerous. But there was one more thing she needed to do before they departed. That afternoon, while the team completed their final preparations, Maya found a secure computer terminal and accessed the personnel records database. She pulled up the files for Martinez and Thompson, studying their photos and reading the summaries of their post-military lives.
Martinez had been working as a high school Spanish teacher in Arizona. His performance reviews were excellent, and his students clearly loved him. He'd been coaching the school's soccer team and was engaged to a woman who taught at the same school. Thompson had started a small construction business in Oregon. He was active in his daughter's school activities and coached Little League baseball on weekends. His wife had died 2 years ago in a car accident, making him a single father trying to build a new life for his family. Both men had been living quiet, productive lives, contributing to their communities and raising their children in peace. They'd earned that peace through years of sacrifice and service, and it had been stolen from them by a man who saw their identities as nothing more than commodities to be sold. Maya printed their photos and tucked them into her gear bag. She wanted to remember why she was doing this, wanted to keep their faces fresh in her mind when the shooting started. That evening, as the team prepared for departure, Admiral Harrison pulled Maya aside for a private conversation.
"I know this is personal for you," the Admiral said. "All of you. But I need you to remember that this is also a professional military operation. We go in, we complete the mission, and we come home. No heroics, no personal vendettas, no unnecessary risks." Maya nodded respectfully, but inside she was thinking about Martinez's daughter and Thompson's twins. About the 41 other operators whose lives were still in danger. About the families who were living in fear because someone had decided their loved ones' identities were worth selling. "Understood, ma'am," she said. But, as she walked away from that conversation, Maya knew that this mission would be anything but routine. Kozlov had made it personal when he targeted her brothers and sisters in arms. Now she was going to make it personal for him. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, Maya Chen wouldn't be hiding who she was. The humid air of Guatemala City hit Maya like a wall as she descended from the commercial airliner. After 3 years in the dry mountain climate of Idaho, the tropical heat and moisture felt oppressive and alien. But, as she walked through the airport terminal, maintaining her cover as Dr. Elena Vasquez, an environmental researcher studying rainforest ecosystems, Maya felt her operational instincts sharpening. The team had arrived separately over the course of 2 days, each member traveling under carefully constructed academic or business identities. Maya's cover was solid, backed by years of preparation and a legitimate research organization that existed primarily to provide plausible stories for intelligence operations. Her contact in Guatemala City was a man named Carlos Mendoza, supposedly a local guide and naturalist who would be assisting their research expedition. In reality, Mendoza was a former Guatemalan Special Forces operator who now worked as a freelance intelligence asset for various American agencies. He had the kind of local knowledge and connections that would be invaluable for tracking down Kozlov's operation. Maya met Mendoza at a small cafe in Zone 1, the historic center of the city. He was exactly what she'd expected from his file: compact, weathered, with the alert eyes of someone who'd survived more than his share of dangerous situations. He spoke softly accented English and maintained perfect cover as an enthusiastic naturalist excited about their upcoming expedition to the Petén rainforest. "Dr. Vasquez," he said warmly as she approached his table. "Welcome to Guatemala. I trust your flight was comfortable?" "Please, call me Elena," Maya replied, settling into the rehearsed role. "And, yes, thank you. I'm very excited to begin our research."
Over coffee and local pastries, Mendoza briefed her on what his network had discovered about Kozlov's operation.
Speaking in code phrases that would sound like discussions of wildlife and ecosystem mapping to any casual listener, he painted a picture of a sophisticated organization that had been operating in the region for at least 6 months. The particular species you're interested in, he said, referring to Kozlov, has been observed in the northern regions, approximately 200 kilometers from here. Our preliminary surveys suggest a well-established habitat, possibly with breeding populations.
Maya translated the euphemisms quickly.
Kozlov had set up a permanent facility somewhere in the remote jungle regions of northern Guatemala, probably with significant personnel and resources. It wasn't just a hideout, it was a full-scale base of operations. What about local territorial behaviors, she asked, inquiring about security measures and potential threats.
Mendoza's expression grew more serious.
The species appears to have established symbiotic relationships with several indigenous populations, he said carefully. Mutual protection arrangements that have proven quite effective at discouraging outside researchers. So Kozlov had bought protection from local groups, probably drug cartels or other criminal organizations that controlled territory in the remote jungle areas. That would complicate any operation significantly, as they'd potentially be facing not just Kozlov's people but also local militants with extensive knowledge of the terrain. After their meeting, Maya returned to her hotel and used a secure satellite communication device to update the team on the intelligence situation. The other 7 operators had been conducting their own reconnaissance activities throughout the city, mapping potential routes, identifying resources, and establishing backup plans. The team leader for this operation was Commander Michael Torres, who had taken over Jack Sullivan's role after Jack had been promoted to a planning position at Naval Special Warfare Command. Torres was younger than Maya but had extensive combat experience and a reputation for meticulous planning and flawless execution. Over the next 3 days, the team gradually assembled in Guatemala City while maintaining their academic cover. Maya found herself working closely with Chief Petty Officer Lisa Chen, a communications specialist who shared Maya's Chinese heritage and had joined the team after Maya's initial departure from active duty. Despite the name's similarity, they weren't related, but Maya found herself feeling protective of the younger woman. The plan that emerged from their intelligence gathering was complex but straightforward. They would travel north to the town of Flores, the gateway to the Petén rainforest region, under the guise of conducting environmental research. From there, they would use local boats to access the remote river systems where Kozlov's facility was believed to be located. Mendoza had identified 3 possible locations for Kozlov's base, all in areas that were effectively controlled by criminal organizations rather than the Guatemalan government. The team would need to approach carefully, gather intelligence on the ground, and then strike quickly before their presence could be detected and reported. The journey to Flores took most of a day, traveling in 2 separate vehicles to maintain operational security. Maya rode with Torres and Chen, using the time to review satellite imagery and topographical maps of their target area.
The terrain was challenging, dense jungle, winding rivers, and few roads or landmarks that could be used for navigation.
As they drove through the Guatemalan countryside, Maya found herself thinking about the contrast with her recent life in Cedar Falls. There, her biggest worry had been whether Jake Mueller would make another cruel joke about her background. Here, she was planning to infiltrate hostile territory and eliminate a dangerous enemy who had already killed 2 of her former teammates. The transformation felt natural, almost inevitable. The quiet waitress persona had been a useful cover, but it had never been who she truly was. This was who she was, a warrior, a protector, someone who stood between innocent people and those who would harm them. Flores turned out to be a bustling tourist town on the shore of Lake Patanitza, filled with backpackers and adventure travelers heading into the jungle to visit ancient Mayan ruins. It was the perfect cover for their operation, as groups of foreigners with outdoor gear and research equipment were common sights. The team established their base at a modest hotel that catered to researchers and ecotourists.
From the outside, they looked like any other academic expedition, earnest scientists with expensive equipment and ambitious goals.
Only a trained observer would notice the subtle signs that marked them as something far more dangerous. That evening, Mendoza introduced them to their local transportation, 2 narrow boats with powerful outboard motors, operated by men who asked no questions and had extensive knowledge of the river systems. The boat operators were clearly veterans of smuggling operations, probably moving drugs or other contraband through the waterways that connected Guatemala with Mexico and Belize.
Maya spent the night before their insertion into the jungle cleaning and checking her weapons.
She'd been issued a compact M4 carbine, a SIG sour pistol, and various other equipment that had been smuggled into the country through diplomatic channels. The familiar weight and balance of the weapons was reassuring, like greeting old friends after a long absence. But, as she worked, Maya found her thoughts drifting back to Cedar Falls. She wondered what the people there were saying about her sudden disappearance. Tom Morrison had probably convinced himself that his suspicions had been vindicated all along.
Betty Walsh was undoubtedly spreading increasingly elaborate theories about Maya's true identity.
Jake Muller was probably trying to downplay his role in mocking someone who turned out to be far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The thought brought a grim smile to Maya's face. They'd wanted to know her secrets, had mocked her for her mysterious background and quiet demeanor. Now they knew exactly who she'd been hiding among them for 3 years. She wondered if that knowledge made them feel safer or less safe, knowing that a former Navy SEAL had been living in their midst. The next morning, the team loaded their gear into the boats and began the journey into the heart of the Petén rainforest. The first several hours took them through areas that were relatively well traveled, passing other boats carrying tourists and local fishermen. But, as they moved deeper into the jungle, the signs of civilization became fewer and farther between.
The forest itself was overwhelming in its density and complexity.
Towering trees created a canopy so thick that little sunlight reached the forest floor. Vines and undergrowth tangled together in impenetrable walls of green. The sounds of the jungle were constant: bird calls, insect buzzing, the splash of fish jumping in the brown water. Maya found herself appreciating the tactical challenges presented by this environment.
Visibility was severely limited, making long-range observation and engagement difficult. The dense vegetation would provide excellent concealment but would also make movement slow and noisy.
Communication would be challenging, as radio signals would be blocked or distorted by the thick canopy.
On the other hand, the same conditions that would make their operation difficult would also complicate any enemy response.
Kozlov's people would have the advantage of knowing the terrain, but they would face the same limitations in terms of visibility and communication. After 6 hours on the water, they reached their insertion point, a small inlet that led to a tributary barely wide enough for their boats. Mendoza consulted his GPS and spoke quietly with the boat operators, confirming their location and discussing pickup arrangements. From here, they would proceed on foot, carrying everything they needed for what could be several days in the jungle. Maya shouldered her pack, feeling the familiar weight of combat gear and survival equipment. It had been 3 years since she'd operated in this kind of environment, but her training and experience came flooding back.
The team moved in standard patrol formation, with Mendoza leading and Maya taking the rear guard position. The pace was deliberately slow and careful, designed to minimize noise and avoid leaving obvious tracks.
Every few hundred meters, they would stop to listen and observe, checking for any signs that their presence had been detected. The intelligence about Kozlov's facility was based primarily on signals intercepts and satellite imagery analysis. They knew approximately where it was located, but the exact layout and security measures were unknown. The facility could be anything from a few buildings in a jungle clearing to an extensive compound with sophisticated defenses. As they moved deeper into the forest, Maya felt the familiar heightening of her senses that came with approaching combat. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds became sharper and more distinct, and time seemed to slow down as her mind processed every detail of their surroundings. They'd been moving for about 3 hours when Mendoza suddenly raised his hand, signaling the team to freeze. Maya immediately dropped to a crouch, her weapon ready, while scanning the forest around them for potential threats.
Mendoza moved carefully forward, then returned and whispered to Torres.
They'd found signs of human activity, a barely visible path that had been cut through the undergrowth, too straight and purposeful to be a game trail.
This was it. They'd found the outer perimeter of Kozlov's operation.
The team spent the next several minutes carefully examining the path and the surrounding area. Chen deployed sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment, scanning for radio signals or other electronic signatures that might indicate security systems. Maya moved along the perimeter, looking for defensive positions, observation posts, or other signs of how the facility was protected. What they found was both encouraging and disturbing. The path was clearly used regularly, with fresh boot prints and signs of recent passage. But there were also indications of more sophisticated security measures, carefully concealed motion sensors, nearly invisible tripwires, and what appeared to be the remnants of previous defensive positions.
Kozlov wasn't just hiding in the jungle.
He was operating a professional installation with serious security measures. This wasn't going to be a simple search and destroy mission against a small group of criminals. This was going to be a direct assault on a well-defended facility, possibly occupied by experienced military personnel. As Maya crouched in the dense undergrowth, studying the approaches to what was clearly an enemy stronghold, she found herself thinking once again about Martinez and Thompson. About their families, about the other 41 operators whose lives were still in danger, about the responsibility she'd accepted when she'd chosen to join this mission. The quiet waitress from Cedar Falls was gone, perhaps forever. In her place was the warrior she'd always been, preparing to do what warriors do when innocent people are threatened by those who would harm them. The hunt was about to become a battle, and Maya Chen was ready for war. The compound revealed itself gradually as the team moved through the dense jungle in the pre-dawn darkness. What had appeared on satellite imagery as a small clearing turned out to be a sophisticated facility carved into the heart of the rainforest. Maya counted at least 6 buildings, including what appeared to be a communications center bristling with satellite dishes and antenna arrays. The team had spent 2 days conducting surveillance from concealed positions around the perimeter. What they'd discovered was both impressive and troubling. Kozlov's operation was far larger and better organized than their intelligence had suggested. The compound housed at least 20 personnel, including several who moved with the distinctive bearing of experienced military operators. Maya lay prone behind a fallen log, observing the main building through high-powered binoculars. The structure was built like a fortress, with reinforced walls, limited windows, and what appeared to be steel shutters that could be closed to create a hardened defensive position. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a command center designed to withstand assault.
"Target building identified," she whispered into her throat microphone.
2 guards visible at the main entrance, rotating every 2 hours.
Pattern suggests professional security protocols. Commander Torres' voice crackled back through her earpiece. "Confirmed. Chen, what's the communications situation?"
From her position near the facility's technical center, Chief Petty Officer Chen had been monitoring electronic emissions and mapping the compound's communications infrastructure.
"Multiple satellite uplinks active," she reported. "Sophisticated encryption protocols in use. This is definitely a professional intelligence operation."
Maya shifted her focus to study the personnel moving around the compound. Most wore civilian clothes, but their movement patterns and weapons handling revealed extensive military training. These weren't just criminals or mercenaries, they were experienced operators who knew what they were doing. Through her binoculars, she caught sight of a figure emerging from the main building. Tall, thin, with graying hair and the kind of unremarkable face that would disappear in any crowd. Even at a distance, Maya recognized him from the intelligence photos. Viktor Kozlov. The man who had sold out her brothers and sisters in arms. The man responsible for the deaths of Martinez and Thompson. Maya felt a cold fury settle over her as she watched Kozlov move casually around his compound, discussing something with his subordinates. He looked relaxed, confident, completely unaware that 8 of the most dangerous people in the world were watching him from the shadows. "Primary target identified," she reported. "Kozlov is on site and active." The plan they developed was complex but necessary given the strength of the defensive position. The compound sat on slightly elevated ground surrounded by dense forest, with only one obvious approach along the path they discovered. A direct assault would be costly and potentially unsuccessful against a well-prepared enemy. Instead, they would conduct a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Chen would disable the communications systems to prevent any calls for help or warnings to other parts of Kozlov's network. Mendoza and 2 other team members would create a diversion at the vehicle compound on the south side of the facility. Maya and Torres would lead the main assault team against the primary building where Kozlov was likely to take shelter. The operation would begin at 0300 hours, when the compound's security would be at its lowest ebb and most of the personnel would be asleep. They would have surprise, superior training, and the motivation that came from fighting for their fallen comrades. As Maya prepared her gear in their concealed camp, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 years ago, she'd been living a quiet life in Cedar Falls, enduring daily mockery from people who couldn't possibly understand who she really was or what she'd sacrificed for their safety. Now she was about to conduct what could be her final military operation, hunting down a man who had betrayed everything she'd fought to protect. The transformation felt complete. The waitress persona had been shed like an old coat, revealing the warrior beneath. At 0200 hours, the team began their final approach to the compound. Maya moved through the darkness like a ghost, her night vision equipment turning the jungle into a green-tinted landscape of shadows and obstacles. Every step was calculated, every movement precise. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd dedicated her life to mastering. The guards at the main entrance were professional but not exceptional. Maya watched them for several minutes, noting their patterns, their attention to detail, their level of alertness. They were competent, but they weren't expecting an attack from elite special operations personnel. At exactly 0300 hours, Chen initiated the operation by deploying an electromagnetic pulse device that knocked out the compound's primary communications systems. The effect was immediate and devastating. Lights went out, electronic systems failed, and confused voices could be heard throughout the compound. 30 seconds later, Mendoza's diversion team struck the vehicle compound with explosive charges and automatic weapons fire. The cacophony of gunfire and explosions echoed through the jungle, drawing attention and personnel away from the main building. Maya and Torres used the confusion to breach the perimeter and approach the primary target. The two guards at the main entrance were attempting to establish radio contact with their command center when Maya's suppressed rifle eliminated them with precise shots to the head. Moving like the professional she was, Maya entered the building through the main door while Torres covered the rear exit. The interior was dark, lit only by emergency lighting that had activated after the power failure. Maya's night vision equipment gave her a significant advantage as she moved through corridors filled with panicking personnel. The first enemy she encountered was a man emerging from what appeared to be a communication room. He was reaching for a weapon when Maya's rifle spoke twice, dropping him to the floor. She moved past his body without pausing, focused on her primary objective. Kozlov would be in the most secure part of the building, probably a reinforced command center or safe room designed to protect him during exactly this kind of attack. Maya followed the corridor toward the rear of the building, using her training and instincts to navigate through the unfamiliar layout. She found him in a room that was part office, part command center, part fortress. Kozlov was frantically working at a computer terminal, probably trying to destroy sensitive data or send warning messages to other parts of his network. He looked up as Maya entered the room, and, for a moment, their eyes met across the space that separated them. Maya saw surprise, fear, and, then, a kind of resigned understanding. Kozlov knew who she was and why she was there. "You're one of them," he said in accented English. "One of the American Special Forces I'd been hunting." Maya kept her rifle trained on him as she moved closer. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Maya Chen. You killed 2 of my teammates. Martinez and Thompson." Kozlov's expression didn't change. "Business," he said simply. "Nothing personal." "You made it personal when you targeted my family," Maya replied. She could have killed him then. It would have been simple, quick, and completely justified. But Maya wanted answers first. She wanted to know how extensive his network was, who else was involved, and how many other operators were still in danger. "Your computer," she said, gesturing toward the terminal. "Open the files on the American operators. All of them." Kozlov hesitated, then seemed to realize he had no choice. His fingers moved across the keyboard, accessing files that contained detailed information on 43 former Special Operations personnel. Names, addresses, family members, new identities, everything needed to target them for assassination or kidnapping. Maya memorized as much as she could, noting particularly the files that were marked as completed, the operators who had already been killed. Martinez and Thompson were there, along with 2 others she hadn't known about. The scope of the betrayal was even larger than they'd realized. "Who's buying this information?" she demanded. "Many people," Kozlov replied. "Terrorist organizations seeking revenge. Criminal cartels wanting to eliminate threats. Foreign intelligence services interested in understanding American capabilities." "Who's your source? How did you get this information?" For the first time, Kozlov smiled. "That, Commander Chen, is information you'll have to obtain elsewhere." Maya was about to press him further when Torres' voice crackled through her earpiece. "Maya, we've got movement on the perimeter. Looks like reinforcements arriving by boat. We need to complete the mission and extract immediately." Through the building's windows, Maya could see the flashing lights of approaching vehicles and hear the sound of boat engines on the river. Kozlov's operation was larger than they'd anticipated, with backup personnel who were now responding to the attack. She looked back at Kozlov, who was watching her with a mixture of fear and defiance. This man had sold out her brothers and sisters in arms for money. He'd turned their service and sacrifice into commodities to be traded to the highest bidder. "You want to know something funny?" Maya said as she raised her rifle. "For 3 years, I lived in a small town in Idaho. Worked as a waitress in a diner. The people there thought I was nobody special. They mocked me, called me names, treated me like I was just some weird woman with delusions about her past." Kozlov's eyes widened slightly as he began to understand. "They had no idea," Maya continued, "that they were sharing their morning coffee with someone who could track them down anywhere in the world. Someone who could disappear them without a trace. Someone who had killed more enemies of America than they could count." She took a step closer. "But, you know what the real irony is? Those people in Cedar Falls, for all their mockery and cruelty, were fundamentally decent. They were living honest lives, raising their families, contributing to their communities. They deserved protection, even if they didn't understand what protection meant." Maya's finger moved to the trigger. "You, on the other hand, chose to betray the very people who kept you safe. You sold out the warriors who stood between innocent people and those who would harm them. You turned honor into profit and courage into commodity." Kozlov opened his mouth to speak, but Maya had heard enough. "This is for Martinez and Thompson," she said quietly. The rifle bucked twice in her hands. Kozlov crumpled to the floor, his eyes already empty of life. Maya felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Only the grim certainty that justice had been served. She quickly accessed Kozlov's computer, downloading as much information as possible before destroying the hard drive with thermite charges. The files would be analyzed later to identify other targets in Kozlov's network and assess the full scope of the security breach. "Primary target eliminated," she reported to Torres. "Data secured. Ready for extraction." The team fought their way out of the compound as Kozlov's reinforcements arrived. The jungle erupted in gunfire as professional soldiers engaged in deadly combat among the trees and shadows. Maya moved with deadly efficiency, her years of training and experience guiding her through the chaos. 2 hours later, they reached their extraction point where Mendoza's boats were waiting. As they powered down the dark river toward safety, Maya allowed herself a moment of reflection. The mission was complete. Kozlov was dead, his organization disrupted, and his database of compromised operators secured. But the victory felt incomplete. The traitor within the American intelligence community who had provided Kozlov with his information was still unknown. Other parts of his network were still operating. The threat to her fellow veterans wasn't entirely eliminated. But it was a start. And, as Maya watched the jungle slide past in the darkness, she knew that her exile from the world of special operations was truly over. There was too much work left to do, too many people still in danger. The quiet waitress from Cedar Falls was gone forever. In her place was a warrior who had remembered her true calling, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, standing guard against the darkness, and ensuring that the sacrifices of people like Martinez and Thompson were never forgotten. The people of Cedar Falls had wanted to know her secrets. Now, even if they never learned the details of this mission, they would understand that their mockery had been directed at someone far more dangerous and dedicated than they could have ever imagined. Maya Chen, the woman they'd called the ghost, had proven that some ghosts are worth being afraid of. 3 months after the Guatemala operation, Maya Chen stood at the edge of the parking lot behind Murphy's Diner, watching the morning rush through the windows she'd once looked out from the other side. The familiar scene felt like something from another lifetime. Tom Morrison hunched over his usual booth, Betty Walsh holding court at the counter, the steady stream of locals beginning their daily routines. But everything had changed, and Maya could see the evidence even from this distance. Where once the diner had buzzed with comfortable familiarity, now there was an undercurrent of tension, of whispered conversations and stolen glances toward the empty apartment above Henderson's hardware store. The woman they'd mocked for 3 years had become a legend. Maya had returned to Cedar Falls for a specific purpose, though it wasn't one her superiors at Naval Special Warfare Command would have approved of. The official debriefing from the Guatemala mission had been classified at levels that would never see public release, and her role in eliminating the threat to former Special Operations personnel was known only to a handful of senior officials. To the rest of the world, Maya Chen had simply disappeared from Cedar Falls one October morning, leaving behind nothing but questions and the memory of military helicopters descending like something out of an action movie. The story had grown in the telling, as stories do in small towns. By now, half the population believed Maya had been a CIA assassin, while the other half was convinced she'd been in witness protection from the Russian mob. The truth was somehow both more mundane and more extraordinary than either version. Maya walked slowly around the building, noting the changes that had occurred during her absence. Someone had installed security cameras, though they were the cheap consumer-grade variety that would be useless against any real threat. Henderson's hardware store now displayed a small sign advertising military surplus items, probably hoping to capitalize on the sudden interest in all things tactical. Most tellingly, Murphy's Diner had added a new menu item, the Ghost Burger, served with a side of classified fries. The marketing was tasteless but effective. Maya could see the place was busier than it had ever been during her time there. She'd been watching for 20 minutes when Tom Morrison emerged from the diner, moving with the careful gait of a man whose worldview had been fundamentally shaken. Maya stepped out from behind her rental car as he approached his pickup truck. "Hello, Tom," she said quietly. Morrison nearly jumped out of his skin, spinning around with wide eyes that quickly filled with something between fear and awe. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the woman he'd spent 3 years dismissing as a harmless eccentric. Maya looked different now. Gone was the submissive posture and deferential manner she'd cultivated as part of her cover. She stood with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, someone who'd faced down dangerous enemies and emerged victorious. Even in civilian clothes, there was no mistaking her for anything other than what she truly was. "Maya?" Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "I don't know what to call you." "Maya is fine," she replied. "Though my rank was lieutenant commander, if you're curious." Morrison swallowed hard, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the waitress he'd tormented with suspicion and mockery. Are you here too?" He couldn't finish the question, but Maya understood. In a town that had suddenly realized it had been home to a genuine warrior, everyone was wondering if there would be consequences for their treatment of her. "I'm not here to hurt anyone, Tom," Maya said gently. "I'm here to tie up loose ends." Over the next hour, Maya had similar conversations with several other residents of Cedar Falls. Betty Walsh nearly fainted when Maya appeared beside her at the post office, but recovered quickly enough to pepper her with questions that Maya deflected with professional ease. Jake Muller actually apologized, stumbling through an explanation of his jokes that revealed far more about his insecurities than his humor. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. The people who had mocked her were now desperately trying to rewrite their memories, to convince themselves that they'd always known there was something special about her. They wanted absolution for their cruelty, validation that their small-town perspective was somehow compatible with the larger world Maya represented. Maya gave them what they needed: forgiveness, understanding, and the assurance that their treatment of her had been understandable given what they'd known at the time. She didn't mention that their mockery had sometimes been the most painful part of her exile, or that their inability to see past their own limited perspectives had reminded her daily of how isolated she'd become. But there was one conversation that mattered more than the others. Maya found Murphy himself in the diner's kitchen, prepping for the lunch rush with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd spent decades perfecting his craft. He looked up as she entered, and, unlike the others, his expression showed no fear, only a kind of weary resignation. "I wondered when you'd come back," he said, not stopping his work. "Figured you might want to collect your last paycheck." Murphy was 73 years old, a veteran of Vietnam who'd opened the diner 40 years ago and never missed a day of work since. He'd been the one person in Cedar Falls who'd never mocked Maya, never questioned her background, never treated her as anything other than a competent employee who did her job well. "That's not why I'm here," Maya said. "I wanted to thank you." Murphy looked up, his weathered hands pausing in their work. "Thank me for what?" "For treating me like a human being," Maya replied. "For giving me work when I needed it, for not asking questions when I couldn't provide answers, for letting me be invisible when that's what I needed most." The old man studied her face, taking in the changes that 3 months of returned purpose had wrought. "You look better," he said finally. "Healthier. Like you found what you were looking for." Maya nodded. "I found my way back to who I really am." "And who's that?" Maya considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, she would have said she was a warrior, a protector, someone who stood between innocent people and those who would harm them. That was still true, but it wasn't complete. "I'm someone who serves," she said finally. "Whether that's serving my country, serving justice, or serving coffee to people who need it. The form changes, but the essence remains the same." Murphy smiled for the first time since she'd entered. "That's a good answer. You staying in town?" Maya shook her head. "No, I can't. There's too much work to do elsewhere. Too many people who need protection, too many threats that need to be addressed." She'd been assigned to a new task force within Naval Special Warfare Command, one dedicated to hunting down the remaining elements of Kozlov's network and protecting former Special Operations personnel who remained at risk. It was dangerous work, the kind that required her to maintain a low profile and avoid any connections that could be exploited by enemies. Cedar Falls had been a refuge, but it could never be home again. As she prepared to leave the diner, Murphy called after her. "Maya? For what it's worth, I'm proud to have known you. This town is better for having had you here, even if most folks were too stupid to realize it." Maya felt tears threaten for the first time since returning to town. She'd found professional validation in Guatemala, had proven to herself that she still possessed the skills and dedication needed for her true calling. But Murphy's words gave her something different, personal validation from someone whose opinion mattered to her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." Maya's final stop was the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Cedar Falls. She'd never visited it during her time in town, but she'd often seen it from her apartment window and wondered about the stories buried there. Now she had her own story to add, in a way. She found a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree and sat cross-legged on the grass, looking out over the town that had been her home for 3 years. From this vantage point, Cedar Falls looked peaceful, even idyllic. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, the late afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light, and the sounds of ordinary life drifted up from the streets below. It was the kind of place worth protecting, Maya realized. The kind of community that represented everything good about America: hard-working people trying to build decent lives for themselves and their families, contributing to their community according to their abilities, caring for their neighbors even when those neighbors were strange and secretive. Maya pulled out her phone and composed a text message to Commander Torres, who was coordinating the ongoing operations against Kozlov's network. Package delivered. Ready for next assignment. The response came quickly: new intelligence on European cell. Briefing tomorrow 0800. Good work in Guatemala. Maya smiled as she read the message. There was always another mission, another threat to address, another group of innocent people who needed protection from those who would harm them. It was the kind of work that never ended, but that was exactly why it mattered. As she stood to leave, Maya took one last look at Cedar Falls. Somewhere down there, Tom Morrison was probably telling his wife about his encounter with the mysterious former waitress. Betty Walsh was undoubtedly spreading an increasingly elaborate version of Maya's return throughout the social media networks. Jake Mueller was still trying to figure out how to apologize for 3 years of cruel jokes. They would never understand what Maya's service had cost her, or what it had given her in return. They would never know about the missions she'd conducted, the lives she'd saved, the threats she'd eliminated. They would never comprehend the weight of responsibility she carried, or the sacrifices she'd made in service of their safety. But that was exactly the point. Maya's job was to stand guard in the shadows, to fight battles that couldn't be acknowledged, to protect people who would never know they'd been in danger. The mockery she'd endured in Cedar Falls was a small price to pay for maintaining the cover that allowed her to do that work effectively. As she walked back to her car, Maya felt a sense of completion that had been missing since she'd first arrived in Cedar Falls 3 years ago. She'd found her purpose again, had reconnected with the mission that gave her life meaning. She was no longer a ghost haunting a small mountain town, she was a guardian angel preparing to spread her wings once more. The people of Cedar Falls would tell stories about her for years to come, each version more elaborate than the last. They would debate her true identity, speculate about her missions, and probably exaggerate her capabilities beyond all recognition. But Maya Chen, the woman they'd called the Ghost, would be somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dangerous, protecting people who would never know her name, standing guard against threats they would never see coming. It was exactly where she belonged. As she drove out of Cedar Falls for the last time, Maya saw Murphy standing in the doorway of his diner, watching her leave. She raised her hand in a small wave, and he nodded in return. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of understanding between two people who had served their country and their communities in their own ways. Behind her, the town settled into its evening routine, unaware that their quiet guardian was moving on to protect other communities, other innocent people, other forgotten corners of America where heroes worked in shadows and never sought recognition for their service. The Ghost was gone, but her legend would endure. And, somewhere in the darkness beyond Cedar Falls, new threats were learning to fear the woman who had once poured their coffee and taken their mockery with patient grace. Maya Chen was coming for them, and, this time, she wasn't hiding who she was.